The man who returned looked like Daniel Mercer. I've never been certain it actually was. I am writing this down because I am the last one left who remembers what happened in the winter of 1910, and because memory is a thing that fades faster than a man wants to admit. My hands are not steady anymore. My eyes are not what they were. But the things I saw in those woods north of Lake Temiskaming have stayed sharp inside me, sharper than anything else in my long life, and I have decided that someone ought to know before I am gone. Daniel Mercer disappeared on the 11th of January. He walked out of our cabin before dawn to check a trapline along the river, and he did not come back. We searched for 9 days. We found nothing. We held a small service for him at the end of the second week, because that is what men do in the bush when there is no body. We said the words. We drank what little we had. We accepted that the forest had taken him, the way the forest takes so many. 21 days after he vanished, Daniel walked into camp. He came out of the trees just before sundown, moving slow, his coat hanging off his shoulders like it belonged to a larger man. We shouted. We ran to him. Joseph Clark wept, and Joseph Clark was not a man who wept. We brought Daniel inside, sat him by the fire, wrapped him in furs. That was when I first noticed. He would not look at the fire. He turned his face away from it. He refused the stew Isaac had ladled into a tin cup, refused the bread, refused even the warm water. He sat shivering with his eyes fixed on the door, and he did not speak for the first 3 hours he was among us. That night, after the others had gone to sleep, I heard him whispering. I was lying on the bunk closest to the wall, and the whispering came from outside the cabin, low and steady, like a man having a conversation with someone standing in the snow. I thought, for a moment, that one of the others had stepped out to relieve himself. But then I heard Daniel answer, from inside, from the bunk across the room, 2 voices, one outside, one within. In the morning there were tracks in the snow around our cabin. They circled the building 3 times. They paused at every window. Only one set led away. The man who came back wore Daniel's face and Daniel's clothes, but I have spent 50 years trying to convince myself that what slept across the room from me that night was the man I had hunted with for 6 winters. I have never managed it. We were a small outfit working the country north of the lake, in the bush between the Montreal River and the high ridges that ran toward the Quebec line. There were 6 of us at the main camp that winter, and another 4 men working out of a satellite cabin a day's travel east. We ran trap lines for marten, fisher, lynx, and beaver. We cut timber when the trapping was slow. In good years we made decent money. In bad years we ate what the forest gave us and tried not to lose any fingers to the cold. Joseph Clark was our foreman. He had come up from the Ottawa Valley as a boy and had spent 30 winters in the bush. He was the kind of man who could read a snowfall the way a clerk reads a ledger, who knew where the moose would be in March and where the wolves would den in May. He kept us alive more times than I can count. William Ross was younger, sharp-tongued, a skeptic of every story that did not have a price tag attached to it. He had been to school in Toronto. He did not believe in spirits or omens or anything that could not be skinned and sold. Matthew Reed was 19 that winter, his first season in the deep bush, eager and quiet and a little afraid of everything. Isaac Crow was the oldest among us, near 60, with a face like cracked leather and a way of going silent for hours at a time. He had worked the bush with Cree and Algonquin guides since he was a boy, and he understood the country in a way the rest of us did not. And then there was Daniel. Daniel Mercer was the best hunter I have ever known. He could track a wounded animal across bare rock. He could find game in country that other men called empty. He moved through the bush the way a fish moves through water, like he had been born to it. The indigenous trappers who worked the same region used to come to our cabin just to trade words with him. They respected him. That is not a small thing. The winter of 1910 began hard and turned harder. The snow came early, in late October, and by mid-December it was past our knees in the open ground and waist-deep in the draws. The cold settled in and would not lift. We had nights of 40 below, then 50 below. The lakes froze deeper than any of us could remember. The fur came in thin. Our supplies ran low faster than we had planned. By the new year, we were already rationing flour and bacon, and Joseph was speaking quietly about whether we might have to send a man to the rail line for resupply. That was the country and the time. That was the world we lived in. I want you to understand it, because what came next did not arrive in a vacuum. It came into a place that was already cold and already hungry and already cut off from anything that might have helped us. The first thing we noticed was the silence. In a normal winter, the bush is not quiet. There are ravens calling in the morning. There is the bark of foxes at dusk, the hammer of woodpeckers, the rasp of squirrels in the spruce. There are wolves at night, sometimes close, sometimes far. The forest has a voice, and a man who lives in it long enough learns to hear it the way another man hears traffic on a street. In the first week of January, that voice began to go quiet. The trap lines came up empty, not light, empty. Day after day, set after set. Joseph thought we had a problem with our scent or our bait. We changed both. The lines stayed empty. Matthew came back from a 4-day circuit of the eastern sets with nothing but frostbite on his cheeks and a strange look in his eyes. He said he had not seen a single fresh track in 2 days, not even rabbit, not even mouse. That is not a thing that happens in healthy country. Then we began to hear the cries. They came at night from a long way off, somewhere north and east of the camp. At first I thought they were wolves. But wolves, I know. These were not wolves. They were higher, longer, and they had a shape to them, a kind of rhythm that sounded almost like words being shouted across a great distance. Almost, not quite. Whatever was making them was not a wolf, and it was not a man, and it was not anything I had ever heard before. Isaac was the first to mention the tracks. He came back from a short scout up the river one afternoon, quieter than usual, and he asked Daniel to come look at something with him. They were gone for almost 2 hours. When they returned, Daniel's face had gone still in a way I did not like. He would not say what he had seen. Isaac would only say it was a track, and that it was bigger than any track he had ever measured in 60 years of walking the bush. That night Daniel sat by the fire and stared at the flames, and he did not speak to anyone. For 3 days after that, Daniel went out alone. He left before light and came back after dark. He took his rifle and his snowshoes and a small pack. He told us he was scouting new ground, that he wanted to find where the game had gone. Joseph did not like it. A man working alone in that country, in that cold, was a man asking to die. But Daniel had a way of making his own choices, and none of us were going to stop him. On the 4th day he came back changed. I do not have a better word for it. He was not hurt. He was not sick. But something had been peeled away from him, some layer of who he was, and what remained underneath was quieter and more watchful and a little bit afraid. He sat at the table that night and ate his food without tasting it. When William asked him what he had found, he looked up and said only, "I should not have gone that far." He would not say more. 2 nights later he was gone. He left his rifle. That was the part that struck me. Daniel never went anywhere in the bush without his rifle, not even to the outhouse. But the rifle was on its peg by the door, and his snowshoes were missing, and his coat was gone, and the bunk where he had slept was empty and cold. We searched for him for 9 days. We followed his trail northeast, along the same route he had been scouting. The snowshoe prints were clear for the 1st mile, then for the 2nd. We found a place where he had stopped and brushed snow from a fallen log and sat for a while. We found another place where he had cut a small slash on a pine, the kind of mark a man makes to remember a turn. We followed the trail into a stand of black spruce where the snow was deeper, and there, in the middle of a small clearing, the trail ended. It did not fade. It did not turn. It ended. The last snowshoe prints sat in the snow like a man had stopped to look at something. Beside them, the snow was disturbed in a wide circle, as if something heavy had moved around him. There were no other tracks, no drag marks, no blood, no sign of struggle. Daniel had walked into that clearing, and Daniel had not walked out. We searched the surrounding bush until the light failed. We came back the next day and the day after. We found nothing more. By the end of the second week we accepted that he was gone, and we held our small service, and we tried to go on with the winter. It was Isaac who took us to the settlement. There was a small Anishinaabe community about a day and a half south of our camp, set on a bend of the river where the water ran fast enough to stay open in places even in deep winter. Isaac had known the people there for most of his life. He had trapped with their grandfathers. He spoke enough of the language to ask honest questions and to listen properly to the answers. He told Joseph that we needed to go. He did not explain why, only that there were things being told around our camp that an elder he knew might be able to put a name to. Joseph agreed. We needed any help we could get. Isaac and I went together. We took a sled and 2 days of food, and we traveled south through air so cold it cracked the bark of the trees. The elder's name was Peter Sakane. He was a small man, very old, with eyes that had gone milky at the edges but were still sharp at the center. He listened to Isaac for a long time without speaking. He asked a few quiet questions. He asked about the cries we had heard. He asked about the tracks. He asked about Daniel. When Isaac finished, Peter Sakane sat without moving for what felt like a long time. Then he said, in English, that he would tell us what he could, but that we should understand that there were things he would not say aloud, because to say them aloud was to call them closer. He spoke of a hunger that walked. He said that in the old times, before the trading posts, before the rail, there had been a thing that lived in the deep bush in the worst of the winters. It was not an animal. It was not a spirit in the way a missionary might mean the word. It was something older. It was the hunger of the cold itself, the hunger of a winter that would not end, given a shape and a will. He said that when men went too long without enough to eat, when they were alone too long in country too empty, the hunger could find them. It could come into them. It could hollow them out and wear them like a coat. He said the worst of it was that some of them came back. They came back looking like themselves. They came back speaking with their own voices, but they were not themselves anymore. They were a door that had been left open, and the thing that had used the door was still on the other side, still watching, still waiting to be let the rest of the way through. He asked Isaac when Daniel had disappeared. Isaac told him. Peter Sakane looked at the floor for a long time. Then he said, if your friend comes back, do not let him near the fire, and do not let him near the children, and do not sleep in the same room with him. Then he said, and if he comes back, he is not your friend. 3 days after we returned from the settlement, Daniel walked out of the trees. I have already told you about that evening, about how we ran to him, about how Joseph wept. I have told you about the whispering in the dark and the tracks in the snow. I want to tell you now about the things we noticed in the days that followed, the small things, the things that built up one on top of another until we could no longer pretend they were nothing. He had lost a great deal of weight. That was the first thing. He had been gone 21 days in country, where a man could not survive 21 days without supplies, not in that cold, not without shelter. His coat hung off him. His cheekbones stood out under his skin. His wrists were thin enough that I could have closed my fingers around them. His skin was wrong. There were patches along his jaw and the back of his neck where the flesh looked frost-burned, dark and waxy, but it did not heal the way frostbite heals. It did not blister. It did not slough. It just stayed, as if the cold had gone into him and decided to remain. There were scratches on his forearms, long ones, 4 parallel lines on each arm, running from the inside of the elbow to the wrist. He would not say where they came from. When William asked, Daniel pulled his sleeves down and turned away. He would not eat what we cooked. He drank water sometimes. He would chew on strips of dried meat if we left them out where he could take them without being watched. But anything hot, anything that had been near the fire, he would not touch. Joseph tried for 3 days to get him to eat a bowl of stew. And on the 3rd day Daniel knocked the bowl from his hands and walked outside into the snow without a coat, and stood there for almost an hour before he came back in. He did not sleep, not really. He would lie on his bunk with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and sometimes in the small hours he would rise and go to the door and stand there listening. Twice I followed him outside. Both times he was standing in the clearing behind the cabin, facing the trees, not moving, not speaking. When I called his name, he turned toward me with a slow, strange politeness, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of a conversation. On the 5th morning after his return, we woke to find a new set of tracks around the cabin. They were not Daniel's. They were not anyone's. They were enormous, longer than any boot I had ever seen, with a deep, narrow heel and 4 long toes that ended in points. They came out of the trees on the north side of the clearing, walked once around the building, paused at the door, and walked back into the trees the way they had come. Daniel saw them too. He looked at them for a long time. Then he went inside and would not come out for the rest of the day. I started writing things down. I had a small ledger I had used for keeping track of my catch. I tore out the pages I had filled and started a new book at the back. I wrote the date of Daniel's return. I wrote down everything I had noticed about him. I wrote down the tracks. I wrote down the whispering. I wrote down what Peter Sakane had said. I did not show the book to anyone. I kept it under my mattress, wrapped in oilcloth. I started asking questions, quietly, the way a man asks when he does not want to start a panic. I asked Isaac first. Isaac had been in the bush longer than any of us, and Isaac had been the one to take me to the settlement, and I trusted him. I asked him whether he had ever heard of a thing like this happening before, to anyone he had known. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me about a man named Henry Lacombe who had vanished from a logging camp on the Spanish River in 1887, and who had come back 6 weeks later, and who had killed his own brother with an axe one night before walking back into the bush and never being seen again. He told me about a Hudson's Bay clerk near Moose Factory in 1872 who had wandered off into the muskeg and returned 10 days later refusing food, who had been tied to a bed by his own wife, and who had chewed through the leather straps before dawn. He told me about 3 men from a survey crew in 1894 who had gone missing in the country north of Lake Wanapetai, and how only one had come back, and how that one had been shot by his own foreman within a week of his return, because of what he was doing at night to the camp dogs. I asked Isaac why I had never heard of any of these stories. He said that you do not hear them in the cities. You hear them at trading posts and in trapline cabins, and only when the man telling them trusts you enough to put the words into the air. I asked Joseph next, more carefully. Joseph did not have stories, but he had heard things. He had a cousin who had worked the camps near Cobalt who had spoken once, drunk, of a man who came back wrong. Joseph did not want to talk about it. He said that whatever was happening to Daniel was a sickness, and that sicknesses had names whether or not we knew them, and that what mattered was keeping the rest of us alive until the spring. William refused to discuss it at all. He said the whole thing was hysteria, that Daniel had survived by eating something he should not have eaten, that the tracks around the cabin were a bear or a moose or a trick of the light. He said the cries at night were wolves. He said Peter Sakane was a superstitious old man. He said that if we kept telling each other ghost stories, we would all be dead by March, not from any creature but from our own fear. I wrote that down too. I went through the camp's old papers. There was a small box of records that had been left by the previous foreman, a man named Bell, who had run the camp for 9 years before Joseph. Most of it was account books and supply lists. But near the bottom of the box I found a folded letter, written in pencil, addressed to no one in particular, dated February of 1898. Bell had written it the winter he closed the camp for the first time, before it was reopened 5 years later under new owners. The letter described a trapper named Augustin, who had disappeared in the early part of that winter and returned in late January. It described how Augustin would not eat. It described how he wandered at night. It described tracks around the cabin that did not belong to any animal Bell could name. It described how Augustine had been found one morning frozen to death on the lake ice 2 miles from camp, with a look on his face Bell could not put into words. It described how 3 other men from that camp had died before the spring, and how Bell had closed the place and prayed that no one would ever open it again. The handwriting was steady at the start of the letter and shaky by the end. I put the letter back where I had found it. I did not show it to anyone. That night I lay awake and listened to Daniel breathing across the room, and I thought about how every story I had collected followed the same shape, and I thought about how we were already 4 weeks into the part of the pattern where men began to die. It was William who saw it first, which is something I have thought about often in the years since. William who did not believe. He had taken the second watch between midnight and 3, sitting by the small window beside the door with a lantern turned low and his rifle across his knees. We had started keeping watch a week after Daniel's return. Joseph had ordered it, and no one had argued. I was woken by William's hand on my shoulder. He did not speak. He only nodded toward the window. His face in the lantern light was the color of ash. I went to the window and looked out. The moon was nearly full that night, and the clearing behind the cabin was bright. The snow holding the light the way snow does when the sky is clear and the cold is deep. The trees at the edge of the clearing were black against the brightness. And standing among those trees, perhaps 40 yards from the cabin, was a figure. It was tall. That was the first thing my mind tried to grasp. It was taller than a man, taller than any man I had ever seen, and it was thin in a way that did not look right. It stood very still. Its head was angled slightly downward, as if it were watching the door of the cabin. I could not see its face. I could not see whether it had a face. It was a shape, a silhouette, a piece of the dark that had stood up and stepped between the trees. But I could feel it looking at us. I have never been able to explain that feeling to anyone who has not felt it themselves. It was not the way an animal looks at you. It was not the way a man looks at you. It was the way a thing looks at a door it is waiting for someone to open. William raised the rifle. I put my hand on the barrel and pushed it down. I do not know why I did that. I think some part of me understood that shooting at it would be the worst thing we could do. Behind us in the cabin, I heard Daniel sit up on his bunk. He did not come to the window. He did not speak. But I heard him breathing, slow and shallow, and I heard him say, very quietly, in a voice that did not sound surprised at all, "You should not have followed me." When I looked back through the window, the figure was gone. In the morning the tracks were there, the same long narrow tracks we had seen before, coming out of the trees, stopping at the edge of the clearing, and going back the way they had come. They did not approach the cabin this time. They only stood and watched. After that night the camp came apart slowly. Daniel began to speak to things we could not see, not loudly, not all the time. But in the corners of the day, when he thought no one was watching, he would stand at the window or by the door and murmur, the way a man murmurs to a child or to a dog, low and gentle and almost kind. Once I heard him laugh. It was a sound I had not heard from him in weeks, and it was wrong in a way I cannot explain. It was the laugh of a man pretending to be a man. The rest of us began to hear the voices too. They came at night, from the trees, and they were not the cries we had heard at the beginning of the winter. These were quieter. These were close. They sounded like our own names, spoken just at the edge of the clearing, in voices we almost recognized. Matthew swore one night that he had heard his mother calling him, and his mother had been dead for 6 years. Joseph said he had heard his wife. William said nothing, but William had stopped sleeping, and his eyes had taken on a wet, hollow look that I did not like. Our food began to disappear. The first time we thought a marten had gotten into the storeroom. The second time we knew it had not. Whole sides of bacon were taken, a sack of flour, the bag of dried beans we had been rationing. The locks on the storeroom door were not broken. The door was not forced. Nothing was disturbed except for what was gone. I asked Daniel gently whether he had been taking food at night to leave outside. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "It is not for me," and he would say nothing else. We began to dream, all of us. The same dream, or close enough to the same that there was no doubting it when we compared what we remembered in the morning. We dreamed of walking through deep snow in a forest we did not recognize. We dreamed of a tall, thin figure walking ahead of us between the trees, never turning, never stopping, always just at the edge of where we could see. We dreamed that we were following it because we wanted to, because we were hungry, because there was something at the end of the walk that we needed more than we had ever needed anything. We dreamed of opening our mouths to call out to it and finding that we could not remember our own names. Matthew began to cry in the evenings. He was 19 years old, and he had not signed on for any of this, and he wanted to go home. Joseph told him we would all go home, that we only had to make it to the spring thaw, that we only had to hold together for another 2 months. But Joseph's voice when he said it was not steady, and Matthew did not believe him, and I am not certain Joseph believed himself. Daniel grew thinner. He had been thin when he came back, and now he was thinner still, even though he was taking food at night that he would not eat by day. His eyes had gone dark in a way that had nothing to do with their color. When he looked at me, I had the sense that something was looking out from behind him, leaning forward, peering through. The blizzard came on the night of the 20th of February. We had seen it building for 2 days, the sky going low and gray, the wind beginning to push against the cabin in long shuddering gusts. By the time it hit, the snow was coming sideways, and the world beyond the windows was a white roar that swallowed the trees and the clearing and everything we had ever known. Daniel went out into it. I heard the door open just past midnight. I sat up in my bunk and saw the gap of howling white where the doorway should have been, and I saw the shape of him stepping through it, and I saw the door swing shut behind him on its own, as if something on the outside had pulled it closed. I woke the others. Joseph swore. William swore louder. Matthew did not say anything, only began pulling on his boots with shaking hands. Isaac was already up. Isaac had been awake, I think, for most of the night. We did not have to discuss whether to follow. We knew. Whatever Daniel was walking toward, we knew that if we let him go into that storm alone, none of us would sleep again for what little remained of our lives. And I think, also, that some of us had begun to dream of the figure between the trees often enough that we wanted, in some buried part of ourselves, to see it. We went out into the storm with rifles and lanterns and rope. The wind tore the lantern light into useless smears. The snow came so thick that I could not see the man in front of me unless I was reaching out to touch him. We roped ourselves together, 5 of us, William at the front, then Joseph, then me, then Matthew, then Isaac at the back. We found Daniel's tracks where they entered the trees on the north side of the clearing, and we followed them. The tracks did not behave the way a man's tracks should behave. They were too far apart. The stride between them was longer than any man could have made, longer than even a running man, and they grew longer the further we went, until we were stopping every few yards to stare at them in the lantern light, because the gap between one print and the next had become impossible. Beside Daniel's tracks, after a while, there appeared another set, the long, narrow ones, the ones with the 4 pointed toes. They came in from the side, joined Daniel's, and walked beside them, step for step. We followed for what must have been an hour. The wind never let up. The cold went into us in a way that felt personal, as if it were searching for something inside our chests. At last we came to a place where the trees opened into a small clearing, and in that clearing we found them. Daniel was on his knees in the snow. The thing stood behind him. I will tell you what I saw, and I will tell it once, because I have spent the rest of my life trying not to see it again. It was as tall as the lowest spruce branches above its head, which would have made it 12 feet, perhaps 14. It was thin past the point that anything alive should be able to be thin. Its ribs stood out through skin the color of wet ash. Its arms hung past its knees. Its hands had too many joints. Its head was long and narrow and turned at an angle that no neck should have allowed. Where its eyes should have been there were only hollows, deep and dark, and yet I felt them on me the moment we stepped into the clearing. It did not move toward us. It only bent its long head down toward Daniel, slowly, with a kind of awful tenderness, and Daniel raised his face to it, and Daniel was weeping, and Daniel said, in a voice that was finally his own again, "I am sorry, I am sorry, I am sorry." Then he looked at us over his shoulder and he said, "Run." The thing moved. It did not run. It did not need to. It took one step, and it was no longer where it had been, and the spruce branches above it shook as if a wind had passed through, only that one place. William fired his rifle. I heard the shot, and I heard nothing happen after the shot. No cry, no impact, nothing but the storm. Joseph cut the rope between us. I think he saved my life by doing that. If we had stayed tied together, what happened to the man in front of you would have happened to you as well, and there would be no one alive to write this down. He cut the rope, and he shouted at us to scatter, and we scattered. I went left, into the trees. I do not remember choosing the direction. Matthew went with me for a few yards, and then I lost him in the white. I heard him call out once, behind me. I heard him call out a second time. I did not hear him a third time. I do not know what happened to William. I heard the rifle fire twice more, far behind me, and then I did not hear it again. I heard Joseph shouting Daniel's name. I heard Daniel answer, and Daniel's voice was strange again, gone wrong again, and then I heard Joseph stop shouting. I ran. I fell. I got up. I ran further. The cold was inside my lungs and inside my eyes and inside my hands. I did not know which direction the camp was. I did not know which direction anything was. I ran because to stop was to die, and because somewhere behind me I could hear something moving through the trees that was not a man and was not an animal, and was keeping pace with me without effort. I came out onto the lake. I do not know how I found it. The wind on the open ice was worse than anything in the trees. The snow on the lake had been scoured down to bare black ice in places, and I slipped and fell and slid, and I crawled, and I got up again. Somewhere out on the ice I heard Daniel. He was behind me, far behind me, his voice carrying across the open in a way that voices carry on frozen lakes at night. He was shouting at the thing. He was shouting words I did not understand, and he was shouting them at the top of his lungs, and the thing was answering him. And the answering was not in any language at all. The shouting moved away from me. I understood, even then, what he was doing. Daniel was drawing it off. Whatever was left of him, whatever scrap of the man I had known, was using the last of itself to pull the thing away from the rest of us. I do not remember reaching the far shore. I remember waking in the snow at the foot of a stand of birch, with the sky beginning to gray above me. I remember crawling. I remember a trapper's cabin I had never seen before, with smoke coming from the chimney, and I remember a man's voice asking me my name, and I remember being unable to answer. I lost 2 toes on my left foot. I lost 3 fingers on my right hand. I lived. Isaac lived. He had gone right when I went left, and he had found his way back to our cabin and barricaded the door, and he was there when the constables came. Joseph was found in the spring, a mile from the clearing, half buried in the melt. William was never found. Matthew was never found. Daniel was never found. The Ontario Provincial Police came up from North Bay when the trails were passable. They were polite men. They were thorough. They wrote down what Isaac and I told them, and they nodded, and they asked us to tell it again, and they wrote it down a second time, and the second writing was shorter than the first. The official report listed the cause of death for Joseph Clark as exposure. The report listed William Ross, Matthew Reed, and Daniel Mercer as missing, presumed dead by misadventure and severe winter conditions. The report mentioned the unusual tracks only in a single sentence, attributed to the disordered observations of 2 survivors suffering from advanced hypothermia and the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. The camp was closed in the spring. The owners did not reopen it. The cabin stood empty for many years and then burned down in a forest fire in 1924. And nothing of it remains now but a low rectangle of stones where the chimney used to be. I left the bush. I moved south. I worked in a sawmill for 15 years and then in a hardware store in North Bay for 20 more. I married. I had children. I did not tell my wife the full story until we had been married for 30 years. And then I told her only part of it, because I did not want her to look at me the way Isaac had looked at me on the morning the constables took our statements. I kept the ledger. I added to it for the rest of my life. I have been reading the ledger again these last few weeks. I am old now, and I do not have many winters left in me, and I wanted to be sure of what I remembered before I set it down. Every story is the same. A man goes missing in the deep bush. A man comes back. A man is changed, and then men die. It happened in 1872. It happened in 1887. It happened in 1894. It happened in 1898. It happened to us in 1910. I have collected 9 more accounts since, from places as far apart as Labrador and the Yukon, and they all follow the same shape, and they all end the same way. If you trap or hunt or walk the deep country in winter and you find a track you cannot name, do not follow it. If a man you love goes missing in the snow and a man wearing his face walks back out of the trees, do not open the door. The thing we feared was not what took Daniel into the woods. It was what followed him back out.